I'd like to welcome all our members, friends and guests along tonight. Guest speaker tonight, Vincent. Now Graham, I only just found out a while ago, he's never ever worked on the railways. Graham spent all his life working for ETSA, and he's also worked overseas for the government. But as a child, he tells me he used to draw railway tracks. I know I used to play on them, but he drew them. And Graham's interest in railways, it just grew over the years, and I think we're in for a real surprise tonight, because what I hear is very, very good. And I'd like you to all put your hands together to welcome Graham. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here tonight, and I might say somewhat daunting when you look around the audience and find at least a half a dozen people who are eminently more qualified to give this a presentation than I am. But nevertheless, we'll have some fun tonight, and I trust you'll enjoy the evening. Before we go too far, I need to define some terms. I need to define some terms before we go too much further. The first term I want to define is in that subtitle there, railways. If we think of railways as just the infrastructure, the trains, the people, the railway environment, the railway system, then we're selling ourselves a bit short, but the title is probably right, the rise and fall of railways in South Australia. But if we're prepared to think of railways as an element of the transport tool of the economic development of South Australia, then that title probably should be more the rise and fall and rise again of railways in South Australia. And I need also to define what I'm going to talk about from the point of view of South Australia, loosely for the sake of this talk, though we could in fact extend it, but we'd be here for several nights if we did. South Australia is that part of South Australia loosely south of Port Augusta. We're going to talk about the 5 defined eras of South Australian railways. Now these dates are very loose because they overlap, they're not definitive, but they'll give you a sort of a rough guide. The first era is the development, then what I've loosely called the railway years, then the era when diesel became king, finally rationalisation and privatisation. In fact, privatisation is indeed much more than that. It's the outworking of the federal government's deregulation and competition policies. So let's get underway. Would you believe that the railways all started on the river? The first railway in South Australia was caused by the fact that we had developed a major national highway of the River Murray, and freight was travelling down the Murray and wanting to find a sensible way of exporting it overseas. And so in 1854 we got our first railway. It was from Goolwa to Port Elliot. You see, because this was May 1854, and in September or thereabouts 1854, Melbourne to Port Melbourne steam railway opened, and of course they claimed they had the first real railway because it was steam. But the Goolwa to Port Elliot railway was a railway. It was a railway at law, it looked like a railway, it had freight and passengers like a railway, except that it was drawn by horses. It was incidentally 5'3" inch gauge, and I'm going to stay with the imperial sizes because most of you will remember them. Yes, so it carried freight and passengers, an archival photograph that many of you will have seen before. And down at Port Elliot, where it terminated, is still more or less visible along the edge of the beach around to the jetty. In fact, if you stand more or less where that photograph was taken and turn around and look the other way, you can still see the cutting where the line actually came down off the cliff and onto the foreshore front. Of course, Port Elliot didn't turn out to be much of a port. In fact, it was a dreadful port, and so in their brilliance they decided they'd move to Victor Harbor. And so by 1864 the line was extended from Port Elliot to Victor Harbor, which coincidentally didn't turn out to be much of a port either, but that's beside the point. We did all sorts of things for obscure reasons in the early days. And Victor Harbor Station, as it was back in those days, or somewhere not too long after that, features a goods shed, which if you stand in that location and look down that track when there are no trains coming, you will see that same building centre in the distance. The stone goods shed, which was built in those days, now forms the Whale Museum of the District Council of Victor Harbor. A little later, a line was built to Strathalbyn. It was built not from Goolwa, but from the middle of the line at Middleton. We won't go into the reasoning for some of these things because they absolutely belie logic in some cases, but nevertheless it was built to Strathalbyn. And a funny little story occurred when it got to Strathalbyn. You see, the proprietor of the Terminus Hotel was 3 or 4 streets away from where the railway station was to be built. And he was a bit upset about this because the Terminus Hotel was where the bus service, the horse bus service, ended of the day. And he could see a difficulty here that if the bus extended down to the railway station, he'd lose his trade. So he lobbied very hard, and would you believe, the railway was extended up the street from the station to the Terminus Hotel, where it still stands today. And of course that junction at Middleton became quite a notable junction on our early horse-drawn railway line. Now, what else happened? What was happening elsewhere? We'll leave the south coast for a while and come back into town here in Adelaide. In Adelaide, there was an interesting debate going on. The Port of Adelaide needed a corridor to the town of Adelaide. And what were they going to do? Well, by that stage, the Port Road alignment had been established and they had left space for a canal down the middle. There's a debate. Should we build a canal or should we build a railway? And that leads to some interesting postulations, doesn't it? What heritage canal in 2008? It would have been an interesting engineering challenge to build the South Road tunnel under the Port Road and a canal. And presumably Torrens Lake, where the marge is going to be built, would be a harbour. However, we didn't do that. We, of course, built a railway. And it was not only the first steam railway in South Australia, but it was the first publicly operated steam railway in Australia. If you use all the words right, you can be first at anything, you know. And we celebrated that 2 years ago, when we, in fact, ran some special trains from Port Adelaide to Adelaide from the location of the museum, which is almost exactly where the Port Adelaide station was when it first landed there. 1856, when the train, 5 to 3 inch gauge, which incidentally on these maps is shown as a purple line, went from Adelaide to Port Adelaide. There were a number of interesting features about that and some interesting stories, some of which I have picked out of the document which was published for that anniversary. The Adelaide station as it was then was built for that occasion, and quote, it was a thoroughly substantial building, furnished throughout and roofed with Welsh tiles. Well, I guess that was pretty important to report, so be it. It used some very unusual rail. Unlike the usual rail, which is a form of I-beam style, it was in fact an inverted U-shape, a hollow bridge rail, and we have in fact got a small sample of that still at the museum, indeed right at the front door for those of you that were down there, and those of you that I invite to come at some future time. The Torrens River Bridge was the next engineering point on that line of some significance. Originally it was a wooden bridge. It was replaced by an iron bridge in 1877 and then strengthened again 20 years later, and that name of Brunel, the famous engineer from the southwest of England, in fact had elements of design in that particular line and that particular bridge area. That line, that bridge which was strengthened then, still carries the port line today. Let's hope it's not like the Mississippi. And the other thing that remains today is the Alberton station, or parts of it. On the left of your picture there, you'll see the stone building with substantial brick pillared verandas. And if you have a careful look at the picture on the right-hand side, you'll be able to pick the same same stone wall is there and the same general roof line is there, though the veranda has been substantially modified. Looking at the state of that particular building around and inside it, one thinks that not much has been done since it was built. And then north of the city there was development going on as well. By 1879 we had some lines that had expanded from Adelaide towards the north. They'd reached Morgan, Burra, and in fact a bit beyond that. Obviously Burra and Morgan were caused by the copper development of the time. And then we started to see this curious event occurring where For each little port around the coast, we saw a line being developed straight inland from the port to service the hinterland and to be able to assist the local produce farmers to export their goods. And so by that time we had lines from Port Wakefield scattered around the mid-north, the line sneaking in from Port Pirie and the line sneaking in from Port Augusta. A year later, the lines kept going. They kept building at quite a high rate, with the narrow gauge lines being built with no thought that they ever might run into the broad gauge lines anywhere, totally independent, totally lack of any overall logical planning, most of it dictated by political whim and political pressure. But by 1880 it occurred, and the narrow gauge and the broad gauge met at the first Australian change of gauge station at Hamley Bridge. Now I don't know whether you'll be able to see, oh yes, you should be able to see that quite well. If you're having a look there, on the left-hand side you'll see, at least on the right-hand side you'll see the narrow gauge, in the centre you'll see the broad gauge, and you can see the difference in gauge there, and on the left-hand side you can see the three rail of a double gauge track. The first one in Australia, the first of about 32 or 33 that we've had scattered around South Australia ever since, and I guess the beginning of that economic blight of the problem of having to change trains with everything. By 1881, we gained a second one of them, probably to become a more significant one than ever, when the narrow gauge working its way in from Port Pirie around through Peterborough met the broad gauge at Tarawi. Now I've wondered for some time, and I must admit I haven't done enough exploring to tell you definitively why. I'm sure somebody over here can tell me why. But why on earth would you build a broad gauge line, which incidentally got there first, to Tarawi? You've all been to Tarawi. Lovely spot as a history spot. That is, if you can find anything that's left. But as a place to draw any produce from? Interesting question. However, that's where they met. The narrow gauge and the broad gauge met at Tarawi. And Tarawi was to become probably the most economically damaging part of the railway system that you can possibly imagine, because in due course it managed to transport people from Port Augusta, it managed to transport cattle from the far north, it managed to transport our coal supplies from Lee Creek to Osborne, it managed to transport the war effort, an enormous amount of activity in transferring goods, people and products at Tarawi. It was another one of those places where General MacArthur stood on the platform and said, "I shall return," and never did. He was pretty good at that, I gather. Okay. Similarly, in the south of the state, the same sort of thing was happening. You can see by whatever date I've got here, 1883, that two of the lines had worked their way in from coastal ports at Beachport and Kingston, and the line was working its way down from Adelaide and ultimately joined up at Strathalbyn with that part of track that was there, and so steam trains arrived in Strathalbyn. And of course Victor Harbor. And not very much later, the line, a major piece of line building when the line was built all the way from then Nairn through to Bordertown, and shortly afterwards connected into Victoria. For a little while, just as a matter of passing interest, there was some dual gauge from Bordertown to the border, and we had yet another change of gauge station as the narrow gauge system of the southeast joined to the broad gauge intercontinental line to Melbourne. And we just about have reached in our story the first turning point from one development era into the next era. By 1922, South Australia had really deteriorated quite significantly as far as railways was concerned. And so the story goes a bit like this. The location is South Australia. The railway system has been slowly running down since its 1854 inception. It has not so recently been through yet another politically inspired expansion of never-to-be profitable branches, and it had just come out of the deprivations of war. A remarkable awakening has occurred in some political circles where it has been realised that the rail system is in need of rejuvenation. That doesn't happen very often, I might add, politically. Among extreme opposition, the Parliament of the day sanctioned the reorganisation of the Railways Department by the establishment of the position of a commissioner, a position with all new powerful authority. And it then compounded its unpopularity by appointing a railway executive, not from Australia, not from the good old UK, but heaven horror of horrors, from the US. And William Webb found when he arrived here a large state, a small population, a government-owned railway, and a rail with a common carrier commitment. He found small locomotives. He found small four-wheel freight wagons. There was uneconomical steam-hauled passenger trains and multiple gauges, with breaks of gauge all over the place. There were totally unprofitable lines, typically those that I've listed here and some others as well. Mount Pleasant, Wombi to Yincarni, if anybody knows where that is. Udunda to Robertstown, Newry to Truro, Monado South to Sudan, Wollonga, and a whole stack of others. There was inadequate engineering, track and bridges, and there was archaic operation of manual working of signals and crossing protection. In other words, nothing much had changed either practically or philosophically since the South Australian Railways had begun with their first public railway in 1854. Webb's task was to do the job. He couldn't control the spec. He had to do what he had to do. But he needed to do it with increased train sizes, reduced train miles, and increased loading per wagon, because his creed was quite clear that expenses are measured by train mile and revenue is measured by tonne mile. And those two things, to some degree, he found, of course, were a problem. So he introduced large locomotives, large bogie freight wagons, passenger rail cars to simplify the passage of passengers in the country areas. He built stronger bridges. He introduced advanced signalling, particularly advanced for Australia at the time, and he converted the Western Division to broad gauge. Interestingly, what that did was it took the break of gauge from Hamley Bridge to Gladstone, but let's not worry too much about little things like that. And so we entered into what I've loosely called the railway years. So big steam power was in charge on passengers, on stock trains, freight trains, and that big power has been preserved, and we have a number of those in our museum for you to look at Port Adelaide. Arising from the depression of the war, this entering into the true railway era was interesting. The rail network was technically advanced and riding on the efficiencies of the Webb development. There was, as I said, large locomotives, there was improved infrastructure and upgraded bridges and state-of-the-art signalling. But it was interesting, the railways were still working the way they really always had. It had an inertia of its own. It had a railway culture. Rules were detailed to the extent of being pedantic, and the railways almost worked because they worked. The railways were the railways and almost existed to be the railways. Attention was directed to the engineering and the operation of the network, and the fact that there might be customers really had very little emphasis. Mind you, they weren't alone in that mindset. At that era, the telephone department or the PMG department, you remember you could have a black telephone or a black telephone. An example of this sort of working environment and its language came to me as a boy of about age 10. The local men's fellowship of the day had arranged a visit to the Adelaide train control. Think of them being allowed to do that today in security environment. During the visit, the controller of the day was given the task of explaining to the visitors the workings of a large graph paper that was occupied most of his desk. Up the left x-axis was distance, in fact downwards in that particular one, and time across the bottom, across the y-axis at the bottom. Directing our attention to the graph, the gist of his explanation that he gave us was that, well, up trains go up and down trains go down. And to a 10-year-old non-railwayman, and indeed to most of the others in the group, that seemed rather blatantly obvious and rather devoid of meaning. It in no way conveyed the intended meaning that trains travelling away from the Adelaide datum were defined as down trains, and that these were represented by lines down the page from Adelaide drawn at the top. It was typical of an automated railway operation and the language which pervaded the organisation and formed its culture of the era. It wouldn't have been obvious to any layperson watching trains in the Adelaide Hills that a train labouring its way up the hill was actually going down, or that a train drifting its way down the hill to Adelaide was going up. But later, by 1951 and then through that sort of extended period to the mid-60s, diesel engines took over. Locomotives of a totally different style and a totally different level of efficiency. They increased the efficiency of the machine. They lowered fuel costs, not only through the cost of the fuel itself and its efficiency, but the handling and the storage of it. It increased time between overhauls. It increased distance between servicing, and of course that meant less depots and of course less staff. Diesel came into passenger services in 1951 when it first headed the overland from Melbourne to Adelaide, which is 75 years last year, and we did a bit of celebrating that down at the museum because number 900, which pulled that train, is down at the museum. And then it became choice on everything, on freights, on lightweight branches in different format, and there I said we've got 900 down at the museum. And that era, as I said, spread over the best part of 15 years or so. It's not easy to define in time, but it certainly demonstrated a real change in the operation of the railways in many respects. The third transition was also a drawn-out affair. Rationalisation, I sort of put on my dateline as being mid-60s or something, but in fact it started in the 50s and went all the way through to the early 80s. The process of rationalisation, most railway lovers over here would use the word demise, I suspect, was triggered primarily by loss of custom. That is, no one out there much needed rail transport anymore. With road infrastructure and motor vehicle technology well established, railway simply lost its small parcel trade and movement of small general lots and livestock. And the movement of passengers in small groups to a multitude of small destinations automatically gravitated to the more efficient, effective, cheaper and quicker mode of transport. Coincidentally, governments realised about that time that to continue to impose on the railways the role of common carrier was no longer practical. In a lecture that I was giving where we were trying to determine learnings from all of this, I guess the learnings of this era were pretty obvious. Times change. Common carrier is only valid for a monopoly. If you haven't got custom, you don't have a service that you can give. Uneconomic inheritances can't survive, and changes reflecting efficiency generally cost jobs. And so the railways were rationalised. Of course, from an infrastructure point of view, we were another 50 years down the track. The advanced track and signalling that had been the pride of the nation in 1929 was 50 years old again. And so with many lines now producing, with so many lines not now producing any serious return, with their custom disappearing, there was absolutely no case to upgrade them, and for that matter really no reason to retain them. And then governments got crafty. If legislation said they couldn't close a railway, they simply stopped running it. Better still, if they could sell the whole or a component of it to someone else, they did that too. And in South Australia, both of those events occurred. 1955 is generally recognised as about the peak size of the railway system in South Australia, and that more or less is a map of the, loosely, of the northern part of South Australian railway system at that time. And what happened? Well, they just disappeared like that. And they went. And so over the next 20 years or so, we saw a substantial contraction of the railway lines in the north. We'll come back to that in a moment. And in the south, pretty much the same thing. There were railway lines aplenty, particularly in the Murraylands area that you can see there. And as the rollout of rationalisation occurred, many of those disappeared as well, as you can see here. Now, that map there is perhaps around about 1980-ish or so, because it's in fact contracted further since then, and we might have a look at that in a moment. And then the next thing that happened in the rationalisation process was that a whole range of lines became standardised. In the north there you can see quite a collection. There's broad gauge from Adelaide to Port Pirie, there's narrow gauge from Port Pirie to Broken Hill, and there's standard gauge from Port Pirie north through Port Augusta and beyond. By this time a couple of odd narrow gauge lines that existed there have been removed. I can't pick the right date for you there, but that really is not important. And then through national government action primarily, in the start, we standardised the line from Broken Hill to Port Pirie to give us a continuous one gauge line from Sydney to Perth, and 20 years or so later we standardised the line from Crystal Brook to Adelaide, giving Adelaide the connection to the standard gauge national network. That connection of standard gauge from Broken Hill to Port Pirie occurred in January 1970. And there's a nice little story that comes from that particular event. Diesels on the narrow gauge hadn't seen much activity, been seen very much around until the mid-60s, when they took over from steam on that narrow gauge system of Port Pirie, Broken Hill and a couple of small branches. But 5 years later, the government had decided to standardise the line through that part of South Australia. The diesels were quite new, and it was obvious that they had a lifetime to go, and it was important that they be standardised. And so for the last 18 months or so, and rapidly increasing over the last 9 months, a number of mothballed steam engines were brought back into service to operate that line until the standard gauge and its diesels then could operate. And so we saw the icon of South Australia's narrow gauge steam locomotives, the so-called Garretts, which, if you're not familiar with them, are really two engines in one with a set of driving wheels each end, and very, very powerful for narrow gauge engines. Indeed, by far the most powerful locomotives, single locomotives ever operated on our narrow gauge system anywhere. And photographers flocked, of course, to the area, and there are many, many photographs of that last 9 months. Down in the south, standardisation took over as well, but much later. It was 1995 before we managed to eventually standardise the line from Adelaide through Wolseley, Surbiton and on to Melbourne. That incidentally left a couple of interesting little disconnected broad gauge lines. Steam Ranger's line from Mount Barker Junction to Victor Harbor remains and is operated by Steam Ranger. The connection to Victoria through Pinaroo still exists and is still there as a broad gauge interface. In fact, we actually have a dual gauge station back there out at the wheat silos at Pinaroo at the moment. And the broad gauge southeastern system south of Wolseley, which has become a political football that no political party really wants to grab hold of, and is now probably almost decayed beyond recovery. And so if you pick on the red lines in that diagram there, you can see that the broad gauge lines coming in at Surbiton up through Adelaide and extending on past Port Augusta and through to, well, indeed, Kalgoorlie and now to Darwin, and the branch line up to Broken Hill formed what was to become a real hub of the Australian national standard gauge system. So the rationalised network emphasised on competitive long distance traffic, largely containerised. Less train miles and longer trains, heard that before. Better track and higher average speeds, abandonment of low traffic branches, increased wagon loading and indeed double stacking. Now, I've called the most recent change privatisation, but it's really much more than that. As I mentioned before, it's the outworking of the federal government's deregulation and competition policies. So where are we now in today's network? Well, the National Track Manager, known as Australian Rail Track Corporation, is more or less the equivalent, if you like, to the airport managers in a model which is very similar to the airport model of organisation. Here we have track owners and rail operators, which are the equivalent of airport owners or operators and airlines. In some ways, I think it's arguable that a reasonable comment to say that the railway model, the railway version of this model, has probably worked better than most of the others. We've had a few takeovers, but nobody's really gone bust and lost a lot of money. The airline equivalent shows you fairly clearly that that has had its problems. And the electricity industry and the banking industry and the telecom industries have all had their difficulties in dealing with the national competition policy. But the railways actually done pretty well out of it. This industry is now doing what it does best, moving bulk and bulked up traffic over long distances between business centres with increasing efficiency and emerging profitability. ARTC operates the tracks throughout South Australia towards the west in Kalgoorlie. It has a lease on the track through Victoria from South Serviceton to Melbourne to Albury, and it now has a lease over a number of lines that give it the access to Sydney, Port Kembla and Brisbane. And we ought to be pretty proud of that. Their head office is in South Australia, in Adelaide. There are not a lot of national companies whose head office proudly boasts as being in Adelaide. We have a variety of operators, generally with lengthy trains. Double stacking of traffic. To the west, you can see the double stacked containers, and that is one of the primary loadings. Full wagon loads, container loads, or in fact specific product loads like minerals over fixed routes. Working over long distances on essentially fixed paths under a single control, the industry is in fact moving forward. And on the east-west national route, the rail has captured more than 80% of the offered traffic. And then you have single-purpose block trains. In South Australia, the most notable of them is the regular daily coal trains from Lee Creek to Port Augusta, smaller regular train from Penrice to Osborne carrying limestone, and the gypsum on the far west coast. Of course, we've got a booming national and international tourist traffic. Great Southern Railway, the operator of our passenger trains emanating out of South Australia, is remarkably doing quite well. Indeed, till a year ago I was telling people, and I believe it was correct, that GSR didn't want to operate the overland, and they were only doing it on the basis that the two governments, the Victorian and South Australian government, were subsidising it. They've taken a pretty bold move of saying we're going to yet again refurbish the carriages and try and market the product, and that's been operating for the last three months. And every time I have had anything to do with it, the load has been full. Quite remarkable given what was happening prior to that. So railways are no longer an arm of the government dedicated to achieving political and social outcomes, such as opening the company. They are no longer common carriers, and they are no longer a monopoly. They are a business working in a highly competitive transport arena. The railway kilometres, expenses versus tonne miles revenue equation is critical, and they are well aware of it. And continuing technology improvements, which are essential for competitiveness, are going on. Railway infrastructure is still expensive. Infrastructure owners must take big picture decisions for investment, and railways clearly have to concentrate on bulk and bulked up traffic. Oh, and in passing, the nationalisation of our railway operations, our major network management has now all but dropped the terms of up and down, because these days a train from Melbourne to Perth goes down and up and down and up. And a train from Whyalla, Melbourne to Sydney, would in fact go up to Port Augusta, down from Port Augusta to Crystal Brook, up from Crystal Brook to Adelaide, down from Adelaide to Serviceton, up from Serviceton to Melbourne, down from Melbourne to Albury, up from Melbourne to Sydney. You see, the whole concept of up and down really is almost no more, and even the deeply embedded culture that we've seen is gradually disappearing, and people are moving forward. I'm inclined to think that if you are prepared to look at this all with something of an open view, you have two choices. You can look from 1955 backwards, and you will see the growth and development of a very interesting, intricate, involved, correct for the day railway system. And if you stand at 2008 and look backwards halfway, you will see a efficient, large, big investment, well operated and generally well run railway system, assisting the economic development not only of our state but Australia as a whole. New South Wales is getting enormous development now that ARTC has taken it over, an enormous amount of work and several $billion being spent in the next 2 to 3 years. and you can drive around New South Wales, and everywhere there is railway work going on. We are in an exciting part of Australia's development, and in 10 years' time it'll be part of history, but it's going to be a glorious part of history. I've brought you this presentation on behalf of the National Railway Museum. We are in fact a non-government funded organisation. We would appreciate any support that you can give us, even just by coming and having a look. Thank you for having me. I trust you've enjoyed the evening.
Did I understand from you that all the railways in South Australia were government built?
Almost all, but
So-
almost all.
Why not have just one gauge then?
You got 3 or 4 hours? Well, there's a lot of history in that, I think the simplest way of looking at it, and this may not be perfectly accurate for the perfectionists, but there were 2 starting points. There was the starting point essentially in Adelaide and the Adelaide environs, and that was dictated largely by a relationship with Victoria that started with the same gauge. Let's not go too deep into that, but that's a rough paraphrase of it. But around the coastline of South Australia, there was a need for cheap, simple, but effective railways to go from each local port straight into the hinterland. And the element of cost was predominant, and so the much cheaper, narrower gauge was used in all of those little places. And that was Beachport, Narracourt, Port Wakefield, Port Pirie, Port Augusta, I suppose arguably Port Lincoln as well, which incidentally is still an isolated narrow gauge network. And from there on we developed the issue. And then overlaid on that, the Commonwealth Government as a separate government organisation decided when it agreed to build the long promised connection from Western Australia and do it under its own auspices with its own governmental railway organisation, chose to build standard gauge. And those choices represent books and books worth. And so we faced the problem eventually in 1930 something or other of having a 3-gauge station at Port Pirie Junction at Solomon Town, where the standard gauge from Kalgoorlie met the broad gauge from Adelaide and the narrow gauge from Broken Hill. Albeit they were 2 different companies, 2 different government organisations, and the gauges didn't physically overlap very much. In fact, from a passenger point of view, they didn't overlap at all. And then the national government decided it was a significant Australian economic requirement that they built the standard gauge from Broken Hill through to Port Pirie to link Sydney and Perth. And what that did was take away, of course, the triple gauge junction at Port Pirie Junction, but in the process make 2 others, one at Gladstone and one at Peterborough. The Peterborough one was an easy one in some sense because there was lots of space and by and large the gauges were more or less kept separate. But at Gladstone, where you had a very small yard, they had to be very innovative, and they effectively laid the tracks one on top of the other, and there we saw about 16 or 17 different gauge configurations of multi-gauge track, including triple gauge track, something that is pretty rare. And again, if you want to have a look at that, the only place in the world you'll see that is in the yard outside our museum at Port Adelaide.
I don't know whether this is quite in your realm, but I've seen the following names for the East-West line. The East-West line, the Transcontinental line, the Indian Pacific line, the Trans-Australia line, and the Trans-Australian line. Do you know whether they all had a sort of official standing, and did we actually use all those names? I have seen them.
Well, we can get rid of a few of them.
Right.
The Indian Pacific line would only be given that name in the context of the train that ran on it. The Indian Pacific is the train, not the line. So let's get rid of that one. The east-west line I don't think was ever called that per se, was it, gentlemen? Ah, yes. But certainly the section, the joining line from Port Pirie to Adelaide carried what we called the East-West Express. But in fact, from Port Pirie Junction onwards, I believe it was called the Trans-Australian, full stop, the Trans-Australian. Transcontinental, I think, was a political term rather than a railway term. And TAR, Trans-Australian, I think, line is probably the formal name of it.
Well, thank you very much, because it's a very confusing little topic.
Yeah. But certainly, these days, I don't think even TAR is used as an abbreviation, because in fact now it is part of the interstate national railway network. That diagram I showed you of a red line from Kalgoorlie, Port Augusta, Port Pirie, Adelaide, down to Melbourne, up to Albury and up to the edge of Sydney, and Crystal Brook, Broken Hill, Parks, and then a bit of a cluster from there on. That red line represents what is now known in the official circles as the Defined Interstate Network, the DIN. And that is the network on which ARTC has absolute control, both in terms of finance and of operating. And so the line from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie really now is just part of the DIN.
Could I ask where most of the trains came from? Were they imported or built here?
I'm sorry.
The trains,
Yes.
where did they come from? Were they imported or were they built here?
Both. If we're talking about locomotives,
Yeah.
both. We built them here and we imported them mostly from England. The Garretts that I spoke to you were built in France. Yeah. We were essentially oriented to the British world in the early days of our railway development and looked British, but later we built them ourselves. We had engineering workshops at Goolwa, Islington. We bought some of our steam locomotives from other places in Australia as well. The most ubiquitous locomotive, I suppose, was the T-class narrow gauge. There was 150 or so of those, and they started to be built at Goolwa, I believe, and then went to Maryborough and other places when the company moved around. Yeah, both is the answer, loosely the answer to your question. We had a very good engineering workshop at Islington, and incidentally, in a small way, still do. Not government anymore.
I wondered if you'd like to make a few comments about the Air Division, please.
About the
Air Division.
Air Peninsula? Okay, well, it is very much a separate entity in its own right. In fact, it was engineered by my great-great-grandfather and built in the early part of the of last century. It's a very long journey, of course, from Port Lincoln all the way through Cummins, Woodner, Minnipa to Ceduna and out to the port of Thevenard, and the branch that went from Cummins more or less due north to Kimber and on to Buckleboo. Like most of the railways, it has been examined from its economy point of view, and the operator has simply ceased to operate on certain sections, and arguably certain sections of that railway network are closed. No trains are currently running north of Woodner until you get to Ceduna, and then there is the route from Thevenard to nearly around to Penong, where there is a gypsum mine, and there are daily multiple trains daily carting quite an economic movement there. The rest of it is grain only now. Large amounts of grain move south out of Cummins and smaller amounts from places further north, and regular trains still running out of Kimber, hauling grain to Port Lincoln. Obviously that's seasonal. It is all narrow gauge, it's isolated, there has never been an incentive to do anything else. And you may or may not have noticed that just recently in various allocations of money from various places, including the government, there has been significant amount of money earmarked and in fact starting to be spent on upgrading the main route up through Cummins and further north. It, like most of the rest of the railway system outside of the defined interstate network, had been run until it fell apart and then let fall apart. You see, we've moved into a new world almost, a world that the railway people of the railway era wouldn't really appreciate very much, and that is that when the government gave away, and I say gave away because that's effectively what it did, when the railway gave away various country railway tracks, they were taken up by private operators. They were almost given these assets, whether they were trains or carriages or tracks. When you get an asset given to you and you are operating for a profit, you don't very often do very much other than what you need to do to continue operate and make a profit. And for that reason, very little is done to the railway system. There appears to be no governmental move to be able to enforce that to be done, because after all, it's those people making the profit, and if they don't make a profit. Indeed, that's one of the reasons, diverging a bit from the Eyre Peninsula for a moment, why effectively there is no carriages being bought for new, other than in Queensland, which is different, but Queensland's different anyway, so let's leave them apart for a minute. Because it's just so expensive to buy new rolling stock. Any carriage that's remotely repairable or rebuildable is grabbed and rebuilt. And that's why, I suppose, the overland railway carriages from Melbourne to Adelaide have just been refurbished. They are the original steel railway carriages from 1951, thank you. And so, and they've been refurbished at least twice or arguably 3 times. And while you can go on refurbishing them, you can do it for an awful lot cheaper than you can buying a new one. And so there is an absolute dearth of ex-spare railway carriages. You can't just run another train somewhere to, say, Darwin and on another day of the week. There just isn't that much left. And that's one of the things you get when you privatise. I don't know what they paid, but it was only a few $1 million for all of the freight tracks around the smaller part of South Australia. And so that's what you get. And if you have a good look at most of the locomotives around the place, they're beginning to look like it too.
I know this wasn't strictly within the area of your talk today, but the line up from Darwin, how is that doing now? Because in the early days, the freight traffic was exploded and then imploded. We've got the Garn, which I gather is very successful. How is that doing, that line? And obviously it will be having an effect on the South Australian system if it's doing well.
Yes, it will have an effect on the South Australian system, though clearly the lines to Melbourne and Perth are much more important to us than the line to Darwin. Well, it was a development line in the true sense of the word, a modern development line. The freight operations, I suspect, have nowhere near reached what they would have liked. There is a reasonable freight working. There is a doubling of the passenger working, of course, because it was 1 train a week only, and now it's 2. The Army uses it on regular occasions, but that's hardly a part of their economic budgeting. But two things have happened in the last 2 years which are probably interesting and indicative. In fact, there's a third one about to. Two mining ventures have now commenced and are hauling minerals north from their mines to Darwin, one from Muckaty and the second one from Francis Creek, a mine that pre-existed. It's been reopened. So there's two mine operations there, and there's a third one from Prominent Hill which is going to be trucked to a point, well, not the Darwin line exactly, but south of Alice Springs and brought south. Incidentally, the owners of the owners stroke operators of the Alice Springs to Darwin line in fact were ceded the Tarcoola to Alice Springs section as well. So it's actually Tarcoola to Darwin now as an entity, and they've picked up a third mining operation. So I guess what happens when you have a railway corridor that is working as a development exercise, you encourage development, and there is some of it happening. Probably still not profitable for them.
10 days ago, we went on the railway from here to Melbourne. First time in about 25 years I've done it. But it still took us 12 hours. Are we going to see that improve? One of the troubles in the hill, twice in the hills, they were giving way to goods trains, and 3 occasions he didn't have signal troubles.
In Victoria, no doubt. They are currently in the process of doing a major rearrangement of the track from Tottenham into Southern Cross, which is only about 20k at the most, 20 k's, and takes you nearly an hour. For no apparent reason most of the time. I've travelled on it myself. I know the arguments and why it should take that long, but I don't know why it really does. That is a bottleneck on the freight network for sure, and you are sharing a freight network. One train of a handful of people is hardly very economic. You certainly will take the second position in the queue. Yeah, it'll get a little bit less, but not a lot. Enjoy it. It's a nice daytime trip. Well, it is now. It was all night time before.